Welcome to Mattermost Developer Bound Peg. My name's Joram. I'm a full stack developer at Mattermost, and today I'll be talking about ReactJS and how we use it at Mattermost. Let me click on the right screen so I can go. All right, so first of all, I'll give a little quick introduction to React. React was built by Facebook. It's an architecture and a UI library. Basically, it allows you to build these componentized UI components and reuse them all over the place in your code. And so basically, if you go to the link down there, I've got there, basically bringing to Facebook's React page, and there are three main points to talk about. So the first one's it's declarative. So basically, I think what they mean by that is you can design and build UI elements without having to touch the DOM. So you can use their declarative JSX is what they call it, which is basically a different type of JavaScript to build their UI elements, and it uses a virtual DOM and compares that to see if there's actually any changes that it needs to update the DOM. So basically, when a React UI component renders, it doesn't necessarily update the DOM every time, and that's one of the things that Facebook and React has been pushing as like a big performance benefit of using React. The DOM's only updated when there's actually changes to the DOM. So then they also talk about React being componentized. So basically this means you build different UI components, and then you can, in theory, reuse them all over your UI in different places in your app. At Mattermost, we try to do our best to do this, and sometimes it's a little harder than it sounds, but it's one of the main reasons for using React, and it's actually pretty cool. And I'll show a little bit of how we do that later on. So, and then the final point on the front page of their website is basically learn once, write anywhere. This is, I think, when React was first being pushed, it started more as learn once, write once, use anywhere, I guess. But they've slowly started to back off from that as they realize that's a less realistic goal, less pragmatic than they originally thought. And they've kind of moved towards learn once, write anywhere. So what they mean by this is like learn the patterns, learn how to use the React architectures in one place once, and then you can use it in multiple places. So they have different incarnations of React. So they have ReactJS, which is just their straight up JavaScript that's meant for being used in web apps and browser applications and things like that. And then they also have React Native, which is the newest one, which can be used to, right now, I think you can develop iOS, Android, and UWP, that's Windows, applications for it. I'm not sure where they are on Mac, but I think they're trying to push that so that you can write React Native and use it all over the place. You can't, having said that, you can't actually reuse code across the ReactJS and React Native apps. Well, you can. I think you can use. There's potential to use some, but it's not write once. It's learn once. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to React, and now I'll talk a little bit about ReactJS at Mattermost. So essentially our entire Mattermost web app is primarily built out of ReactJS. All our components live in the directory right there, platform web app components. I'll show that in a second, and also show an example UI component as well. So let's do that right now. Oops. Okay, so if I go over here, this is our GitHub repo here, and I'm in the components directory. So this is basically where we keep all our React components. It's kind of a monster of a directory right now. You notice at the top we've got some folders and directories that we've tried to split out some views with, and that's something we're working towards as a developer goal. But yeah, so they all live here. Everything you need to do with them is here. And then I'll show an example of a specific one. So this one's one I actually recently wrote. You can see there, J Wilander at the top. That's me, for adding a searchable channel list. So basically, this is what a React component looks like. You extend React.component. You have a class name for your component. There's a constructor, so this is where you do your normal constructory things. Due to a small annoyance in, I think it was ES6, we have to bind this to all the component functions manually. You can have your component-wide variables if you need them. And then there's state. So state is one of the two main ways components hold information and retrieve changes in information in React. So state is usually used more for specific changes in the UI. Now, I say that, but if you look all over our code, there's going to be places where we don't do that, and we have a bunch of random stuff in there as well. We're trying to move away from that and to be using more of the other one, which is props. So you notice here, props are passed into the constructor. So props are basically anything that's passed from the parent component down to the child component in React. And the idea that we're trying to move forward with Flux and sooner with later with Redux, which I won't talk about too much this brown bag, but we'll do one on later, is that all the data that the component should need to render should come from the props. So I'll show a bit of that down here. So if I go to the bottom, we have our props defined. So we have our channels, which is basically we're going to list a bunch of channels to make them searchable. And then we have some functions that are passed down from the parent that we need to use. So other parts of a React component are the mounting. So basically what mounting means is once this UI component's been added to the DOM and rendered at least the first time, it's considered mounted. So anything in component did mount, which is a function that you can override that React provides, is going to be called after that first render. And there's a bunch of other functions like that. I won't go through them all here, but component did update is another one. It's very similar to did mount, except instead of being on the first time it mounts and first time it renders, component did update gets called on every other render past the first one. So here we just have some other functions within the component. Next page, previous page, do search. So the component can set state on itself, and every time you set state in React, it triggers a render. Also, anytime the props change from the parents, a render is also triggered. And then we come down to the main function here, which is render. So basically, this is where you actually build the UI of the component. And you do it using JSX, which is this weird, well, it's not really weird, but it's basically an extension of HTML. So you see here we have div and p tags like you normally would in HTML. You also have like formatted message, and it's like, well, that's not an HTML element. That's actually a JSX element, and that's from from the localization library we use. So which is just another React component, and that's how you'd use React component and a render method. So if I scroll down here a little bit more, basically whatever's returned from the render method is what's rendered. And anytime there's a change to either the state or the props, this render function gets called again, and this is returned. React does some special comparison to check if anything's actually changed, and then it'll update the DOM if it needs to. So yeah, that's just essentially what a general React component might look like. I won't go into too much more detail there. All right, let's go back to the slides here. Okay, so talked about the example UI component, and now there's also, so we can talk about the architecture a little bit. So ReactJS is great, but by itself, it's not enough. So at Mattermost, we use two more things. First, we use React Router, which I'll talk about. Lets us be a single page app. I have a slide on that coming up. And then also we use Flux, which is basically a pattern for how data is handled and how actions occur, which I'll talk about next. So Flux, as I said, it's a pattern that defines how React components perform actions and retrieve data. Flux, there are three main pieces of Flux. There are actions, the dispatcher, and the stores. So if you look at the little diagram here on the right, you notice that if you start with React views, you have some sort of user interaction. So maybe this is clicking on search, as in our previous example, or typing something into the search box. So basically, that's a user interaction. An action gets created, which is actually the search. The action will go do everything it needs to do to complete that action. So some of that might be talking to the web utils. Maybe you need to make a request of server. In the case of search, you would. And then once it comes back, the action fires off, uses a dispatcher to fire off a callback to the store, which will update the store, and the store will then send change events to the React views, so the React views get the updated state once it's retrieved from the server and gone through the whole pass. So I'll back out of here again and go show the actions and stores and dispatcher real quickly. So actions, this is our actions folder. Basically, a lot of the actions in the system belong here. Let's look at post actions for an example. Let's see if I can find a good one in here. Okay, so load posts. This is something that we do pretty often. So essentially, what happens here is this is the action for load posts. So anytime a UI component somewhere needs to load posts, it'll call this action. It'll do a bunch of stuff, make a request to the server to get the posts based on the channel ID provided. And then here you can see we dispatch the posts through the dispatcher, and the stores will pick that up. I'll show that in a minute. And then, but there are also a couple other things that need to happen when we get posts. For example, we need to load the profiles for the posts if we don't have them. And then we also need to load the statuses for the channel. So basically, let's see if I can find that in here. Load profiles for posts. So basically what this does is another action that also is triggered by our previous action to go get profiles for any posts it doesn't have. And that's completely asynchronous. So when it comes back, it'll fire off through basically the same throw through the app dispatcher, through the stores, and back to the React view when it's ready to get it. And the statuses works very similar, the same kind of way. So I'll show this dispatcher stuff real quick. It's not very exciting. This is just how we fire off server actions and view actions. Yeah, nothing too much to show there. And then we can show the stores, which is where basically all the storage of all the server data is kept. So let me find the post store here. All right, so we can look in here, scroll down to the bottom where we can see the dispatches being handled. So we got a bunch of them in here for the stores. The one we're concerned about right now is received posts. So after that action completes and it fires off this received post action, it'll come here. And then a few things happens. One, it gets stored. It's the post store stores the posts. It does some checking bounds, which is for some visualization of the posts once in the UI. And then it emits the change. So once that change is emitted, there will be, actually I can probably find it here. There will be a component that's listening for that change. So let me see if I can find it real quick. On the post view, I think it's post, yeah, wrong one. Post view controller. So if we go in here, and let's find it. There it is. Okay, so you see here we've added a change listener to the post store called for on post change. So if I search for that, so at any time that event gets fired, which we just saw in the post store right here, the emit change, all the listeners will get that event, and the new state for the store will be set, or the props will be set depending for the lower down components. So that's just essentially quickly how that works. Yeah, so that's basically how we use Flux at Mattermost. We're still not completely Flux. When we describe ourselves, we usually say we're Flux-ish, and that just basically means that when we started building React for our web app, this was kind of before Flux was a thing, and it was also very early in the lifecycle of React, or life of React, I should say. So we implemented Flux, or decided to go with Flux partway through. So we still haven't gotten everything moved over, but we're in an effort to do that. And I should mention that in the future, we might move the web app to Redux. This is what Redux is, a little bit different than Flux, but same kind of idea. And it's basically what we're using for the React Native app, and it actually solves a lot of problems we actually have with Flux. But I won't talk about those right now. That's a whole brown bag in itself, so that'll come later. Okay, so we also have React Router. React Router is basically what lets us be a single page app. We used to have, anyone who remembers, we used to have a web folder and a web.go file in on the old version of I think Mattermost 2 or before that. But basically what would happen that web.go would do is handle all the different routings for all the different pages you could go to in the Mattermost app. Now with React Router, that's all handled within the app itself, locally on the client. So anytime you see the URL change, that's not actually making a get request to the server. It's just actually React Router manually changing the URL and handling all that locally. So basically, it lets us be a single page app and allows us to do quick navigation, but it also lets us look like a normal website at the same time. And it also provides handling for going to specific routes or specific URLs, I should say. And something also cool about React Router is in conjunction with Webpack, it allows us to do smart bundling of the JavaScript. I think we're doing a bit of this now. But basically, before when we first loaded the page, you would have to download all the JavaScript required for the app. But now with React Router, you don't have to do that. You can split up the bundle into different pieces so that you only download the components and all the JavaScript you need for the specific page you're on. So for example, if you're familiar with Mattermost and you go to the integrations page, I'm not sure if, I can't remember specifically if we're doing this right now, but in theory, you can load all that, the integration stuff in the background. And when someone clicks on that, instead of having to load it all in first page load. So I'll give a quick example of what the routes look like. Oh, this is just their web page or their GitHub. Back into this real quick. Okay, so we have this routes folder in platform web app. So basically, this is where all the routes are defined. So if we go into root, you can see here how the paths are defined. So the root path is slash. We have the login path, reset password paths, and all these different paths here that are defined locally on the client here. Yeah, so that's basically how it works. So if you needed to add a new root, this is one of the, if it was root, it would be in this file. And then we have all the different roots as well. So root team, this is where the main app with your channel view lives. Yeah, so that's React Router. And let's move on a little bit. So we also have, oh, sorry. Yeah, okay, so developing ReactJS at Mattermost. So if you want to work on ReactJS stuff at Mattermost, basically you just go clone the repo there, and I'll give a quick little rundown of how you can do that. So basically we have, if you're in your platform directory after you've cloned the repo, you run make run to start up the server, and it also build and bundle all the client code for you automatically. But it also starts a watcher process. So it picks up any changes to the JSS or CSS on the fly and then rebuilds the client for you. So, so I'll give a quick little example of that. So, excuse me. So if I do make run, I'll actually type out the command here and so use my aliases. You'll notice that server should start up and the watcher process should build. And see there, that's the client building. We've got some warnings we've got to deal with. And that's the server logs coming up, and we'll have to give it a second for that to come up. So while we're waiting for that to happen, let me grab a file here to change root file, for example. So build real quick here. I swear it doesn't take this long unless you're actually watching it. Okay, so all done. So the first time it builds, it does this output of all the files it included. So here, if I change this file here, save it, you notice down here it's rebuilding. And there, so all my changes are included now in the client code. I'll get rid of that because it's not valid. But yeah, so that's essentially how it works. So if you wanted to stop this, you just type make stop, and everything gets stopped, and the watchers and the server are all stopped. Make run only does partial source maps, but if you want the full maps, you can do make run full map. It'll take a bit longer, but it's much better for debugging, so you can do that as well. Cool. So that's a little quick rundown of how to develop ReactJS at Mattermost. So there's a couple other notables and some future topics to talk about. So client unit tests, if I click on that, in web app, we have a test folder, and this is where all our tests are right now. We don't have a ton of tests specifically for the UI components. It's something we want to improve on, is something we're working on. So if anyone wants to help with that, we'd love it. So this is just a quick example. Like we have a spinner button, and this is just a quick little test for it. The majority of the tests are just testing the driver itself. Yeah. So that's pretty straightforward as well. And then some future topics that will relate to React and ReactJS is one will be developing React for performance. There's a lot of different ways you can, a lot of different tools you can use that'll help you develop React more performantly. One of them is making use of the should component update function that you can override. And then React Native, which we'll have a brown bag on in the future once we've got that a little bit more nailed down. And then Redux, same thing. Once that's a little more nailed down, we'll have a brown bag on that in the future. So if there's no more questions, that's the end. Or any questions, that's the end. All right, thanks for watching.